Good evening. My name is Sean Wilson. I'm the Artistic Director of the Ottawa International Writers Festival. On behalf of the festival and our partners, the Ottawa Public Library and Library and Archives Canada, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to our live virtual event with Emma Donoghue, celebrating her new novel, The Pull of Stars. I'm broadcasting from the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe. I want to take a moment to thank our festival members and donors for making our 2020 virtual season possible. I wish we could all gather in person, but I'm thrilled we can at least stay connected safely this way during the pandemic. Our bookseller is Perfect Books on Elgin Street, but if you're not tuning in from the Ottawa area, I'm sure there's an independent bookseller wherever you are who would be happy to sell you a copy. Our host this evening is the astounding Kagiso Molope. Kagiso is an award-winning writer whose books Such a Lonely, Lovely Road, but a gay medical student in AIDS-ravaged Cape Town in the 80s, was on the CBC's list of best Canadian fiction in 2018, while this book, Betrays My Brother, was selected as one of the Globe and Mail's 100 best books of the year. Both those books are available from Perfect Books or wherever fine books are sold. Please give a warm virtual welcome to our host this evening, Kagiso Molope.
Hey, hello.
Hi.
Hi, Emma. Welcome, and thank you for being here, and welcome to the Ottawa Writers Fest virtual edition.
My pleasure.
How are you doing?
Fine. Just, treasuring this summer, all the days in which we're able to be outside and seeing people at a distance. I don't want to waste a single one of them.
It's almost over. Oh, it goes so quickly. So it has been such a pleasure reading The Pull of the Stars. And my first question is, writers always talk about how the book comes to them. So some people say it's the story first, and other people say it's the characters first. What's your process usually like, and how did this one begin for you?
Sure. I think the only comment I could make on my process is that I'm a huge planner, but the books come to me in different ways. This time around, it was the situation rather than specifically a story or a character, and it wasn't based on a real person like many of my books have been. It was the idea of the 1918 pandemic. I only gave it any thought because I was stuck on a train to Toronto to the TIFA festival without my laptop. I'd left my laptop charging at home. So I had to read the magazine I had with me cover to cover, The Economist magazine. And there was a long article about the flu pandemic of 1918 because this was 100 years later, 2018. And I was just so gripped by the notion of it as a modern plague, that you'd have this busy urban life, people all over the world, crowding into their cities or rushing off to war, and yet terrified of this invisible germ among them. So I had an idea for writing a pandemic novel which would have an almost post-apocalyptic atmosphere rather than feeling like traditional historical fiction. And, I wrote the entire novel in 2018 and 2019 with no thought of contemporary relevance at all. So I would say that in a way I chose the characters in the story based on my wish to capture the weird atmosphere of that particular plague. Yeah, so it's an unusual one for me in that the situation came first.
Right, and you do capture it so well. I mean, it's a fantastic read. I always think that a great marker of excellent storytelling is patience. And I think you do that so well. I was so in awe of that. And at the beginning, even before Julia gets to the hospital, I feel that so much happens. It feels like a whole day has happened. Just because you take so much time giving us the details, you really go through what's going on in her head, and you really go through what she's observing around her. How does the writing happen for you? Is it like a burst, or is that sort of sense of patience also in how you get into it? Does it take you a long time, or is it like a really quick write for you?
Well, I would say I write fairly quickly because I research very thoroughly, and I spend a lot of time you know, mulling over decisions. Like, for instance, I knew that because in a way that my hook was that I learned that the particular terrible flu in 1918, the people most vulnerable to it were women in late pregnancy, approaching birth, or for a couple of weeks after birth. And so I thought, oh, you could set a novel in a maternity ward, because that would not only be a kind of double medical drama, because each of these patients is dealing with labor as well as the flu, you know, and these storylines wouldn't necessarily match, but also that would be like this intense kind of communal experience for women of suffering and bonding, very much equivalent to what men were going through in the trenches, you know. So in setting it in a maternity ward, I knew that a lot of the details of my story would be these births. So I really kind of collected births, you know. I thought, oh, you know, I had one bad thing happened to me during a birth, and I thought, oh, I'm going to use that. And then a friend of mine almost died during her birth. I thought, oh, I'll use that one too. So I kind of systematically collected births and tried to work out which ones would be a good contrast with each other. I thought I'll have one of them go horribly slowly, and then one of them go scarily fast, you know, and unpredictable stops and starts and so on. So I would say I do so much planning that then by the time I'm writing a scene, it usually comes quite fast, because at that point I already know why I want to write that scene. You know, it's got a kind of an urgency behind it. Yeah. But of course, you know, it's different for every writer, isn't it? There's absolutely no rules to this job.
Absolutely no rules, and everything happens different. Every book sort of happens differently. Speaking of the births, you know, you really present the women as soldiers at work, right? You know, there's a point where Brighty says to Julia, "This is your fight." And I think that throughout the book, there's the sense that, you know, they have the battle scars. They are constantly fighting. And that was the intention, right?
Definitely. And also, I could have set this novel anywhere, right? Everywhere in the world, and people were dying of the flu, and women were very vulnerable to the flu, and it caused terrible side effects, and it disrupted births and so on. But one reason I chose Ireland, okay, it's partly because it's my home territory, but it's also partly because the Irish expected their women to have so many children. I mean, between the Catholic Church's definition of, you know, the good woman as she who produces unlimited babies, but also specifically Ireland, you know, prided itself on its women having babies. So if you were living in the Dublin slums, really the only way you could have value as a woman was to give your husband many, many children. So I was fascinated by the idea that, of course, this is something we comment on all the time nowadays with COVID. You know, pandemics don't hit people at random. They are not remotely equalizing. They hit people who are already down. They hit the people who our society has chosen to keep in bad conditions. So if you were living in the Dublin slums and having 12 babies and tainted milk and no fresh air and no sunshine, you know, you would be weakened long before one particular virus ever got hold of you. So I really wanted to analyze you know, the hyper maternity and the pro-natalist aspect of Irish culture at a moment when, you know, its horrors show up. And of course, these women are glad to have their children too, and they love them, and they're sad if they lose a baby. But I wanted to show the weirdness of a society where women were really breeding machines. You know, you don't need science fiction for a situation like that. There's many moments in human history where it's been all about pumping out those babies.
Absolutely. Yeah, and you I mean, as a writer, of course, you give the story so much, the characters so much compassion. You give the women in the ward so much compassion, but Julia as well, in her thinking of them, in the way she relates to them, is very compassionate. And it's clear that, you know, you really wanted to center their stories.
I did. And, you know, it's funny with Julia as a nurse and a midwife, my main concern was that I thought modern readers might judge her as either, you know, ignorant or cold, because she doesn't do the things that nurses and midwives would automatically do nowadays. So I was trying to be really true to nursing and midwifery as it was practiced in 1918 in Ireland, and yet not have Julia seem cold or harsh. So for instance, here's the thing, one of the women in the novel has a stillbirth, right? So standard practice in 1918 was that the nurse would whisk away the stillborn baby, put it in a box on a high shelf, never refer to it again. So that seems brutal to us. And I didn't want to be all anachronistic by having Julia have this big touchy-feely chat with the mother, but I at least thought, okay, I'll give Julia a few sort of reservations. She might be like, oh, should I perhaps have encouraged the mother to look at the baby, you know? So there's moments when I tried to, through Julia's stream of consciousness, suggest ways in which she's not that happy with the medical protocols at the time, but I still wanted it to be very true to the system she's working in. I mean, one real gift to me as a novelist was that it's not a normal situation that she's working in. She would have been trained in a very hierarchical, orderly hospital situation, which was quite military in its origins. So you know, when I looked at how nurses were trained, there were many different subject headings about, you know, protocol and composure and being ladylike and being calm and quiet, and very few that were actually, you know, medical as we would see them. But the thing is, because Julie is working at a time when the hospital is radically understaffed, so many nurses and doctors are off sick or dead, so she gets to bend the rules a bit. So with historical fiction, you often have that slight tension that your readers want somebody to be more modern and free and, you know, taking independent action, and you're trying to be true to 1918 and how a nurse really would have been. And so in a way, the pandemic lets Julia Power, you know, act in a way that strikes us as a bit more from the heart, just because things have got so entirely, you know, unpredictable in that hospital.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, and that's kind of the one of the exciting things about the book is that you do give the pandemic so much heart. You know, somebody was saying recently, when this is all over, everyone will be talking about this pandemic in sort of technical terms, in sort of, you know, this was the virus and this was how people had to, you know, get through it and wear masks and whatever. And we're not going to get the human story behind it. And I think that's what's great about this book, is that we really get the human story behind what was happening at the time. Even in the middle of giving all these, you know, technical and medical terms and details, the story always stays with giving the character's heart, and her love really is I think what develops is that she develops a sort of a protective sort of feeling, would you say, around her patients?
I would, yeah. And, you know, her own mother died in childbirth, as so many did. And I think she has this real sense of mission, you know. It's quite exciting writing about a woman who's defined by her passion for her job. You know, she really loves it, even though nurses at the time, very badly paid and very little status. You know, they were highly trained, but most of the books for nurses written by doctors, Churka in 1918, they say things like, you know, we're only explaining about the cervix and the placenta so that you will know enough to call the doctor. Okay, don't be doing anything. You know, they were really meant to just watch and wait and implement doctors' orders. But again, I thought if the hospital is so understaffed and there are moments when there are just no doctors around, then maybe Julie will get to take a bit of action on her own. So it set up quite an exciting situation for me. But I wanted to show that whole web of care in hospitals. You know, healthcare is never given by one person. So, you know, I feature orderlies and porters who push people in and out in wheelchairs, and a couple of doctors, especially one real doctor at the time, Dr. Kathleen Lynn. I wasn't looking for any historical figures to put in this novel, because historical figures are more trouble than they're worth often, you know. It's quite awkward to work around the facts of their lives. But in my researches, I came across her, and she was not only a doctor with a qualification in midwifery, but she was also running a free flu clinic for the poor, and she was a major rebel. She was the chief medical officer of Sinn Féin, the revolutionary movement. She was on the run from police while my novel was happening, so I could not resist her. So I was, in the first draft, I gave her a fictional name, and then I was like, this is Dr. Kathleen Lynn, and I want her to be a little bit better known. So yeah. I named her in the second draft. You know, you have to be willing to change your mind, you know.
Oh no, absolutely, all the time. I just want to mention that we do have our Q&A section open. So if anyone watching wants to ask questions, please fire away, and we're gonna have a Q&A session towards the end.
Please do, everybody, because, you know, like all writers, I'm missing the live events. I mean, I know virtual events are wonderful in that we can reach sometimes a wider span of people, and we can be reached by people, you know, at times of their own convenience if they watch it afterwards. So that's all great, but there's nothing like the actual lively crowd of book lovers, you know. So I dream of better times where I can actually hear these questions face to face.
Oh yeah, absolutely. There's, you know, you feel the connection when the people are, you know, sitting right in front of you. It's so different this way, isn't it? Well, and speaking of these kind of strange times, you said in an interview that you you're interested in that moment where people find themselves in very unfamiliar situations and they have to adapt. How are you adapting right now with everything that's going on around us?
I feel a little sheepish that my pandemic has been really a pretty comfortable one. You know, it has involved a lot of comfort television. I have watched every season of the US show The Office. I'm now halfway through Schitt's Creek. I've been working maybe a little more distractedly, but doing plenty of work. I probably had a more relaxed time with the kids than usual because, you know, I do a lot of, you know, driving them to classes and so on, and all that was just cancelled. So for once, instead of having the family calendar in the kitchen be absolutely crammed with events, it's just been blank since April. So I've really quite relaxed into just letting the teenagers do their thing. And so, yeah, I feel slightly sheepish to be, you know, here writing about pandemic and talking about pandemic and having such a comfortable time, you know?
Yeah, well, you know, I don't think there are any rules right now, right? Everything is so different. You know, we like the characters in the book. We have to just make up our own rules as we go along, you know, and it doesn't have to be exactly the way it used to be or anything like that. So you take us into a world full of chaos. I would say it's sort of a quiet chaos. You know, I love that line where you say Dublin was a great mouth hold with missing teeth. It's such a great picture.
Yeah, you know, Irish teeth are notorious. You know, my teeth are actually okay for an Irish person, but really we're notorious for our bad teeth. And also, of course, you know, having babies without good healthcare, that can leach the calcium from your mouth. So, you know, I think missing teeth is a specifically Irish mother image. You know.
Yeah, it's a really great image. I really held on to that. It really stayed in my head. So I mean, I really love the descriptions of the you know, the raised bookshop, the burnt post office, the row of hearses. It's not very comfortable, right? But the thing that you do is that you really stay with the chaos. So it's funny, somebody was saying, you know, the book is so unlike Room because it's a completely different timeline. It's a completely different, you know, and then I thought, you know, it's funny because I've been reading the book and I've been reflecting on it. And then I thought about the way that you take us into that supply room that's now a, you know, makeshift ward, and how you have us stay there. And in those moments, I feel, you know, even when we leave, even when Julia is outside of the maternity ward, we sort of are in her head in that we go back into the ward where, you know, the way she's concerned about her patients when she's not with her patients. But you do have us stay with the chaos. You do have us.
I have this bad habit now of confining my characters and my readers. It's true, the door isn't always technically locked. But yeah. In my 2016 novel, The Wonder, a nurse is watching a girl in one little Irish cottage, or even a novel that I might think of as totally different, right? So my last novel, Akin, it's like a road movie. You know, this man and this boy are traveling off to France together, but then somebody commented in a review that because this man is stuck with his obnoxious great nephew, you know, it's a bit like being trapped together on the road. Yeah. So, you know, there is an element of trapping to all these books, and I would say it's simply easier to create really intense dynamics between human beings if you don't let them get away from each other. And also it can happen fast. I love quite compact novels. I love being in one time in one place, and every little exchange conversationally between the people will pay off because, you know, even just over one shift in a hospital, people will start to refer back to what they've said and start little jokes going and remember little things they've said. And I just love that kind of intense weave of references as people get to know each other. And in a situation sufficiently tense and urgent, like when you're saving lives together, I think you could get to know each other very fast. So in a way, the novel is a little kind of chain of three women. You've got Julia the nurse, and then this doctor hired just temporarily by the hospital, Dr. Kathleen Lynn, who kind of mentors Julia and awakens her politically. Because Julia keeps saying, oh, like, I don't have time for politics, I'm busy. She doesn't want to give any thought to the whole question of should Ireland still belong to the king or should it be its own free nation? But Dr. Kathleen Lynn, as a revolutionary, keeps pointing out, you know, the reason the poor are dying in the slums is that, you know, Ireland doesn't get to rule itself. So she keeps trying to persuade Julia that really everything is politics. And then on the other side of the sort of power spectrum of hospital life, you've got this volunteer called Bridie Sweeney, and she's just a volunteer, but Julia is so desperate for someone to help that she's willing to take on this completely untrained young woman and kind of teach her on the job. And they get to know each other very fast and very intensely. So I really had fun sort of seeing in a way how fast I could have these women transform each other's lives under sufficiently intense conditions, you know, like a petri dish.
Right. And it's the women holding I mean, it's not just the women holding the book together, but it's really the women holding, a whole sort of community together, right? I mean, they're really holding together the women who are in distress, who are very unwell. And there's a lot of loss, right? There's so much grief, so much grieving that goes on in that room.
That's true. And I sweated over my decisions about, you know, who lives and dies, because I didn't want it to be, you know, given that it's about a pandemic, I couldn't have it all go too well. I knew that there had to be losses, and I really agonized over which ones would happen and how not to make them too predictable. And, you know, how much could the reader bear? It's a funny thing kind of mulling over the empathetic sufferings of your reader, because you know that your readers want to be made to feel, you know. It's funny, my 13-year-old, if she ever sees me, you know, crying over something I'm reading, she's like, why would you read it then? And I'm like, adults don't really feel enough, and we need to be made to feel. It's why we like, you know, beautiful, sad music or whatever. It sort of awakens our dulled nerves, you know, but there are limits to that. So I always think, for instance, if I'm making my readers be quite distressed about some things, I have to give them sweetness in other areas, or give them some consolations or satisfactions, you know, like, for instance, there's a kind of an evil nun character, and, you know, I think by the end of the novel, really everybody wants Julia to stand up to the evil nun. So it's funny, I don't think about my readers demographically at all, you know. I don't try and kind of classify them, but I think a lot about what they might be feeling and what they might know at every point as well. You know, I give them hints of things, but don't want to make it too obvious, and that's tricky, because of course some of your readers will get it from a single hint, and some of your readers won't get it even if you almost spell it out. So yeah, I do a lot of trying to sort of imagine myself into the head of my readers.
Right, yeah. I mean, you don't just give the reader some sweetness. I mean, you do give the women, the relationships between the women as well. There is sweetness there. I mean, there's that gorgeous evening on the rooftop. And I don't want to give anything away for anyone who hasn't read it, but you go really, as always, really slowly. And it does seem like a moment of beauty, you know, in the middle of all that chaos. That
one comes out of the title, strangely enough, because I was going to call it the pull of the stars, which is a phrase which literally means, is the literal meaning of influenza, right? 14th century Italians apparently believed that influenza was caused by, you know, the malign influence of the stars on us. So I like the idea that the stars are kind of, you know, tugging at us in their implacable way. So once I was mentioning stars in the title, I thought, well, they have to see some stars, so I'm going to have to give them a bit of a break, and will they go for a walk? And then I thought, no, I don't want them to get far from the hospital, but I'll let them go up on the roof and have a kind of a glimpse of it. And then I thought, oh, that'll be lovely if we have like a little bit of a rest, because when we're in the ward, it's just non-stop action, really, apart from the odd cup of tea. So I thought it would be lovely to have a sort of a respite scene. And I also said to myself, I'll give them something nice to eat, because, you know, my novels in Ireland tend to have pretty bad food anyway, you know, traditional Irish 19th century food, for instance, horrible stuff. And I knew that, you know, in the middle of the war, it would be even nastier. The bread would be full of little dodgy bits and pieces, and there'd be a lot of turnips on a show. So I said to myself quite early on, they've got to have something nice to eat in the hospital. So I decided that Julia's brother would give her for her birthday a couple of chocolates and one orange, you know. So I was, as you see, I was kind of doling out the small pleasures there. But yeah, it's crucial to give your readers breaks, and so I thought a lot about the kind of almost choreography of the book, you know, the variation in pace between the frantic scenes where, you know, different women are at different stages of the birth process, needing different forms of help. And then a few quieter moments when, say, Julia gets to go home to her brother and he's, you know, bought a fruitcake. And also because in the ward, everyone's asking Julia for things all the time, I decided that her brother, who's a war veteran, he would be mute. I liked the idea that she might have a relationship with him that's really not based on any words, just on other forms of sort of tenderness that he can show her. You know?
Yeah. And the reader really feels that tenderness because the novel reads like a thriller. You know, you're constantly just wondering what's happening next and what's the next, you know, crisis coming around the corner. So when you do get to those moments where she's with her brother at home, or, you know, that rooftop scene, you really feel a bit relieved, like, okay, I can breathe for a little bit, and it is quite beautiful.
I thought a lot about breathing, by the way. I think because there's so much labor in the book, and there are a lot of moments when, you know, the women have to be coached in, like, you know, little light breaths so that you don't push too fast, or long pushy breaths. And so I sort of thought of that for the reader as well, kind of encouraging the reader through the stages of, you know, big push now and then a rest. You know?
I know it does really work that way. Their relationship evolves quite a bit, Brighty and Julia, within a really short space of time. Was that the plan from the very beginning? You said you're a planner, but did you really see it that way?
I did, yeah. It's funny, when I talk about my planning, I always fear it'll sound cold-blooded, and it's not. It's a kind of a, you know, it's kind of like a really intense daydream. Once you've got your characters and your story set up, you know, I find myself mulling over, you know, scenes that might happen between them, or ways I can inch them closer together, you know, and the planning allows me to drop some things in early, you know. So for instance, okay, here's an example. I wanted an image of sort of sacrificial death, you know, and I decided that I would have the women just chat over this film they've both seen, you know, a Mary Pickford movie. It's actually a lost film where this woman leaps into a volcano, you know, but by getting them to have a little chat early on, which seems like just a bit of fangirling, like, oh, I saw that movie too, did you like that movie? You know, but it helps me set up that image of kind of glorious, brave, sacrificial death there in a very casual way, rather than pointing it out in some big heavy way, like, my father died in the war. So it lets me mention it lightly. And all I can say is that if I was writing the novel chronologically, I mightn't have known to do that at that particular point, but the planning really helps me see where I need to sort of sprinkle in the seeds of things, you know. But I mean, some writers can do all this without conscious planning. They just do it like way in the back of their head, but I need to plan. And the planning also lets me see my own weaknesses, frankly, because I'm not a great natural plotter. You know, my natural pace is relatively rambling. So the planning really lets me see, like, oh, maybe I've got two scenes there where women are suddenly overtaken by the need to push quickly, and like maybe I only need one of them, you know. So it can let me remove actual characters and storyline because I realize there's a duplication there. So it lets me kind of edit myself, you know, improve my own sort of weak plotting as I go along.
Right. And you said, I think it was in The Guardian, that you find that sometimes you really like to make political decisions. So you're really deliberately political in your work. And in this one, what were the key moments where you felt you were making very strong political decisions?
That's a good question, because it's not always in the bits of your novel which read most overtly politically, you know. Like you know, a moment where somebody gives a bit of a speech, you know, that's a moment where their opinion shows. But actually, you as a writer have made your decision a long time before that. I think in particular, I make my decisions about who to write about or whose point of view to tell a story from. I think that's the crucial decision in any book. And it still maddens me that, you know, there are so many writers out there, you know, just deciding to make their book all about, I don't know, say, you know, comfortable white middle class life somewhere. And their books are not seen as political because they're very status quo. And so they're just seen as neutral. Whereas, of course, they are deciding to leave out the rest of life. And then, you know, if a book is, say, more overtly feminist, it'll be noticed as political, when really we're all deciding what to center. So I would say the political thing about The Pull of the Stars, first and foremost, is being set in a maternity ward. And I suppose early on, I might have thought, oh, will it be seen as a bit narrow or only of interest to women, you know? And then, of course, I had to say, who cares? And also, when you're writing about birth, you can't hold back or do it in a kind of a verbally veiled way. You just have to go all in, and, you know, fluid starts splashing quite early on. And you have to say to yourself, I will lose some readers, but that's fine. You know, I read lots of books. They can read a different book of mine.
Yeah.
Sorry, my light just expired there. All the little technical things that go wrong in online sessions. But yes, I would say centering the novel in a maternity ward, and in particular deciding to set it in an inner city hospital where you know, most of the clients would be women from the slums. I think that gave it much more of a political edge than if I'd been writing about women in a more comfortable nursing home or something. And it's funny, you know, since COVID, I've been so aware of all the echoes about, you know, how, what's the phrase I came across the other day? Yeah, SDOH, social determinants of health. You know, basically the pull of the stars is all about those factors, like, you know, these women having 12 babies, or, you know, not enough healthcare, bad water, bad air, how all these things weaken them long before the virus ever gets to them. And although I was copy editing the book in April, I didn't add anything, I didn't change anything, because it was all a kind of a case study of social impoverishment in the context of a pandemic already. So I suspect you could write about any pandemic and you would find these same things, you know?
Right. We have a lot of questions, so I'm gonna open them up in a few minutes. But, you know, a friend said once that sometimes you write a book and then sometimes a book writes you, which means that, you know, in the end, you come out quite changed. How did you come out of this book? Do you feel that you come out changed?
That's a good question. It's really hard to tell the distinction between COVID and this book, isn't it? Because, you know, they happen to be sort of back to back.
Yeah.
So I feel as if just a few years ago, I would have been rather, you know, oblivious to many unjust aspects of my society. I feel I'm seeing them more now in a more visceral way. But I can't quite tell, is it the book or is it COVID? You know, it's one of these things. Once you start noticing, you know, like many people who work with words on a computer, I got to stay home, right? And I was afraid to go to the supermarket, so I would have my groceries delivered, and I would look out the window at the person bringing me my groceries, and I would think, oh my God, you just went into a situation of danger because I was scared too, and I paid you to. You know, and all I could do was like tip lavishly and feel bad, you know. But I'm certainly noticing moments like that more. I feel I'm seeing the kind of invisible force lines in every society. And this book certainly maybe prepared me to notice that very strongly.
Yeah. But what about Ireland? You write about it from afar. You write about, you know, your first home really from a distance. What about your relationship with the country? Are you also feeling like your perspective has changed a lot as you keep writing about it through the years?
But also it has changed so much too. So I think if I had written a book like this 20 or 30 years ago, it would have been a kind of a, you know, Ireland is so stuck in the past. But actually now Ireland has modernized so fast. I feel I'm kind of part of a generation of Irish people who have been revisionist about our history and who have pointed out some of the horrors of Ireland and who have contributed to social change. I mean, my generation of people in Ireland, for instance, have brought in, you know, access to reproductive choice for women for the first time. Ireland voted by referendum for same-sex marriage rights. So it's been amazing to see the country change so fast. So I certainly don't feel I'm like ranting about the country I left behind me. It's more like I feel part of an Irish generation, and many of us are abroad. I mean, Ireland has always sent so many of its people abroad. We're just part of it. We're its diaspora. We may not, you know, vote, but we still get to take part in its culture. So I feel when I'm critiquing Ireland, it's the way many writers who live there do too. You know, people like Anne Enright and Joe O'Connor and so on. And luckily for me, I still feel very much part of Ireland, because not only do I go back a couple of times a year, but I've been lucky enough to work with, you know, say the National Theatre in Ireland on the stage play of Room, or making the film of Room with an Irish company. So I've got strong working relationships there, and that really helps to make me feel still part of the conversation, you know?
As you have grown as a writer, do you find that you've become more comfortable with not wondering who your audience is or who your reader is? Do you find that that's changed through the years? you were saying earlier that you try not to, you know, pick a demographic of who your readers are.
In the early days, it's not that I cared who my readers were, but I was probably aware that, you know, at least with my first couple of novels, which were contemporary, that probably my audience would have been mostly female, you know, lots of gays and lesbians. And then with my first historical novel, Slammerkin, I suddenly got this big American audience for the first time. So my sense of who my readers potentially are has kind of widened over the years, but it's always been a fairly non-specific relationship in that I certainly don't, you know, think about target age or anything. And because a lot of readers can write to you directly these days, it's just so easy through email and so on. I get these wonderfully random fan letters from, you know, men and women and old and young and a real mixture, you know.
Yeah.
So I find that really nourishing. But, you know, I think I've always been lucky enough to write a lot of books, where I'm very prolific. And so that kind of takes the pressure off you to find your ultimate audience with any one of them. Because, yeah, there'll be some people, you know, probably brothers of mine who may not read this one because it's so full on about childbirth, but they'll read others. So I try not to kind of chase the readers. I certainly, you know, unlike, you know, genre writers of, say, romance or crime, I don't feel that I have a set audience who wants something in particular from me. I think if an Emma Donoghue reader wants anything, it's probably to be surprised, and they will like some of my books and they won't like all of them.
Right.
And certainly you can't, you know, you can't get an audience by chasing it. And the fact that Room sold so well when it's really such a weird and creepy premise for a novel, a child growing up in a locked room, you know, sometimes if I'm explaining it to somebody in a lift or something, I think that sounds really sicko. So that would be an example of where, you know, I didn't set out to write an international bestseller. So there's an element of the random to all of these things.
Right. Yeah. We have so many questions. Let me jump into some of them. Someone says, are there lessons from the book that can help us get through COVID? What do you think?
Yes, there probably are, in that the details may be different. You know, like, for instance, masks were not that reliable in 1918. Europeans didn't bother with them much. Americans did, but again, had big sort of anti-mask, you know, protest movements even then. So masks were used very sporadically, and typically people would wear them outside in the street and then they would take them off as they got into a building. So I don't think they achieved much. So the lessons to learn are more things like, you know, the crucial importance of hands-on care, you know, how important health workers are and how we should treat them better. So I really tried to capture the kind of, you know, unsentimental heroism of healthcare workers at every position on the spectrum, from high status doctors down to completely untrained volunteers. And, you know, I think we've realized recently that we tend to do a lot of, you know, hollow gestures or clapping for these people, but not actually give them either the safety or the time off or the rewards that they deserve. And I in particular, I tried to capture their kind of dark humor, because I read books like, say, you know, Brian Goldman's books about working on the night shift in Toronto, an emergency ward. And the way he'd talk about, you know, the kind of, the way they'd crack jokes about the patients and have little codes for them and so on. I'm sure throughout history, you know, doctors and nurses have only got through by cracking the odd joke. You need a certain amount of humor when you're kind of, you know, dancing with death all the time.
Yes, absolutely. Given that you plan so much, if you still have scenes that end up in the shredder, to the ending process, I think it means, do you still have scenes that end up?
Yeah. No, that's a good question. I do, though not as many as before I became a big planner. I think I became a big planner with my novel from 2008 called The Sealed Letter. But one reason was that I'd written a truly baggy novel before that called Life Mask. And Life Mask, in a way, was so long and rambling. I mean, I'm fond of it, as of all my children. But it was very formless and trying to capture the rhythms of real life in the late 18th century. So they went on and on and on. So with The Sealed Letter, because it was about a divorce case, I remember thinking, you know, it's going to be a waste of this gripping material if I let this book get baggy. So I really, for the first time, kind of charted what scenes and which would be told from which point of view. And I felt I really learned a technique for tightening up the whole structure before I started writing the scenes. So I've been doing that ever since. And so I would say I throw away way less. Whereas with Life Mask, I think I threw away about a quarter of it. I seem to remember my publisher saying, you've got to get 100 pages off it, you know. So less gets thrown away, but you have to be absolutely willing to throw away. I certainly throw away entire conversations and occasionally a plot line. Yeah, but it's more that a lot of things get discarded before you even write the scenes, because I do a lot of sort of sitting around staring into space and going, do we need that bit? And with the style for this book, I tried to be very ruthless, and I'd read it aloud, and if there was a word I didn't need or that interrupted the rhythm, I would drop it, because I wanted it to be sort of pared down to the bone to suit this particular, you know, tense storyline. Some novels have room in them for kind of idle chat, and this one just felt urgent, you know.
Right, yeah. Someone wants to know if there were characters you dropped when you were writing this one.
No, I don't think so, no. No, this one was pretty tight from the start, partly because it's about a pandemic, right? So the possibilities for getting lost or being too expansive or too loose or trying to cover too much, that could really be disastrous. I mean, literally this book could have followed the pandemic anywhere, or you know, could have started to include the, you know, the war. If I'd had a number of different characters and followed them, it could have really lost its way. So I was just convinced from the start that just as, you know, a woman in childbirth is kind of confined, you know, that was the word for it, confinement, just as she's trapped in a room and there's no way out but by giving birth, I wanted my readers to feel the same way, you know.
Yeah. Someone says, I don't have a question, but I love the book for its history and also how the subject matter is current. I want this to be a required reading for my staff. Thank you for creating a vivid account of quick decision-making in the midst of a crisis. I'm a rule breaker and can relate to Julia.
Oh, that's wonderful. I love when I hear from people in the medical world, actually, because, you know, when they start the email with, I'm a physician, I always think, oh no, he's going to find me out or she's going to expose me for some terrible mistake. But no, they're usually saying you've got it right. Now, partly because I had a lot of help, I was incredibly lucky. I had a copy editor who is an emergency room physician. So she was actually working through, you know, the worst weeks of COVID and copy editing my novel, you know, alternately. And also I found a midwife to consult with in Hamilton, and she gave me the midwife's perspective on many of the scenes. So I was so relieved to have those two, because, you know, I thought I cannot mess up the medical stuff here, you know. This stuff is really not just truthy, this stuff needs to be actually true, you know.
I wonder whether you considered writing the story as creative nonfiction rather than a novel. Why or why not?
No, I never have. It's funny, even though I put a lot of facts in my books and sometimes even write about real historical characters, I still like the basic kind of contract of fiction, which is that, you know, I don't have to provide evidence for any, but I do my research, but then I can sort of make up the bits I need to make up. Now, of course, I realize I'm sounding a bit old-fashioned there. You know, to be honest, creative nonfiction was not really a label when I started writing. There was, you know, there was gonzo journalism or unreliable journalism, and then there was fiction. So perhaps the sort of creative nonfiction concept wasn't really a big thing when I was starting, so I never really thought to define my work that way. But I find fiction such a wonderfully expansive form. You know, I've included novels where I'm pretty much giving chapter and verse from somebody's real letters, and then novels where all the characters are invented. And again, I've written novels where, say, the bits set in a court case, you know, are very much what happened in court that day, but then the bit in between is completely invented because there's no record of what they did when they went home from court. So I love that flexibility in the novel form, you know. And, you know, again, I've been working a lot in film and TV these last years, and there's so many rules there. I remember once a project I was working on, it moved from a broadcaster who didn't have ads, commercials, to one who did have ads. So suddenly I had to break everything into these sections and have a little mini crisis before the ad break. So it was like suddenly doing it all in the form of sonnets or haiku. You know, the rules were so difficult. So by comparison, fiction is just this free zone. You know, you can have your own quite elaborate scheme, like a novel like, say, Reproduction, which has been such a hit in Canada this year. You know, he's got a wonderfully arcane kind of pattern to do with DNA, but you know, the reader doesn't have to notice that. And again, you know, you can decide on your own rules for each book yourself. It's just a wonderfully free form.
Yeah. Did you find your research depressing, given the magnitude of the 1918 pandemic? Also wondering how many Irish died during the pandemic?
Sure. I'll answer the second question first because it's a sort of factual one. I think about 20,000 died in Ireland, which was not particularly high. I mean, given that overall in the world, it's estimated that between 4 and 6% of the population died. It was nothing like that in Ireland. It was maybe more like 1%. So I didn't choose Ireland because it was the worst hit. I just chose it because I thought I could get Ireland right. And also because Ireland was going through such fascinating political changes around then that I could imagine the flu to have been part of the sort of crucible out of which our independence grew. But no, the death rate wasn't particularly high there, but still enough to be horrifying. And also, I think in many societies, we are more used to losing the old. I mean, it can still be devastating. I'm not in any way discounting the deaths of the old, but given that people always used to die young, in a way, living to a ripe old age is a very modern idea. And I think we all know that illnesses can seize on the old. So in 1918, by contrast, the horror was that often grandparents would survive and young parents wouldn't. It hit people between 20 and 40 the hardest, and pregnant women the hardest. So it struck so many people as being entirely against the natural order, you know. So you had a situation, I suppose I've read about some communities in which, you know, a lot of grandparents are looking after children whose parents have died of AIDS. So a similar kind of weird, you know, inversion of the traditional patterns of child rearing. So yeah, that was the flu situation in Ireland. But as to whether I found the research depressing, you know, it's funny. I absolutely love writing, and that includes the research. And once I've decided on a subject, I'm excited by it. So where a normal person would read some tragic account and be depressed by it, I'm like, grist to my mill, you know? and you know, this sounds really strange, doesn't it? But what I'm longing for at that point is to write a really vivid scene which will capture the experience of these people in 1918 and bring it vividly into the mind of somebody now. So if I can find a little heartbreaking detail that helps communicate that, I'm happy that day. I'm like, oh, that was a good morning's work. Now I have my lunch, you know. So all I can say is that this kind of writing about grim subjects, it's very therapeutic, you know. Yeah. And you face your fears. You're looking at, say, you know, mortality and, you know, the likelihood of sickness, misery, and death, and then it leaves you kind of, you know, ready for an evening watching television and eating cake, in my case. You know?
No, I can completely relate. How did you develop the Brighty character and her specific background?
Sure, Brighty is the only character that I've ever based on a government report. I know this sounds very odd. I wanted Julia to have a volunteer, a helper who would have no status at all, just someone from the absolute bottom rung, a volunteer with no training. And Ireland, much like Canada, has been going through agonizing kind of questioning of its own history in recent years, because Ireland institutionalized a huge percentage of its population. So even before independence, and you know, under the British government, we had, you know, a vast string of mother and baby homes, so-called Magdalene homes, where fallen women would be sent, or teenage girls who people thought might be about to fall. We had orphanages, industrial schools, reformatories for teenagers. And the orphanages, often, they weren't orphans, they were working class kids, basically, you know, taken away from their parents because they were found playing music on the street. And just as in Canada, we're aware that these residential schools, you know, were a horrifying weapon of genocide. In Ireland, very similar things happened, but not to any particular ethnic group, but basically to the poor. So the Irish government did a big investigation into abuses in these institutions, and I read the entire report, and it was just a more heartbreaking. That was truly depressing, actually, because these were all real cases and just so tragic in their details. And as I read the report, I found myself thinking, okay, I'm going to have Brighty come from what she calls, you know, the pipe, That's a phrase I borrowed from, the pipeline, as it's used nowadays to talk about the kind of being kicked out of school and into the prison system. So I wanted to give Brighty really the worst of backgrounds, such that she has no reason to be grateful or to have anything to give, but she does. She's kind of natural human goodness and humor and energy and curiosity triumphing over her circumstances. Because here's the thing, it's not that she's noble, it's that for the first time in her life, by volunteering in Julia's ward, she finds herself appreciated and useful. Because I think the awful kind of killing time factor in these institutions, the kind of the low standard of education and the feeling of doing meaningless bits of work to basically earn money for the nuns, and they would have girls praying on an industrial scale, for instance, literally chanting hundreds and hundreds of prayers that the nuns would then be paid for. They'd be so hungry, they'd be nibbling on candles. So it's that kind of little detail that I tried looking for in this report. I frankly left out more of the horrors, the sort of capital lettered horrors of rapes and beatings and starvings and so on. And I looked for those tiny little details where a girl would be rebuked for having red hair, for instance, or curly hair. They'd be seen as, kind of marks of the devil. So as soon as I got to that detail, I thought, okay, Brighty's having red curly hair, So yeah, in a way, I composed her out of witness testimonies. I tried to just give her a natural spark that nothing could put out. Because, it's funny, people sometimes, they'll send me miserable anecdotes. They'll say, like, my great grandmother was in the workhouse and died there. And I think I can't make a story out of that. That's just all sad. But if there's a twist, like if there's somebody who's from an orphanage, but yet is a kind of a natural comic, if there's something unexpected in the situation, then I kind of smell a possibility of fiction,
Right, yeah. And her closeness with Julia also brings some sweetness to her life. I mean, it's not just the volunteering, the actual work. There's a sweetness to. I mean, so the thing about that is that it's like bearing witness, right? So when you are bearing witness through your work, the element of it being depressing, is kind of taken away, I think, sometimes. So
that's true, because you're not just pointing at sad things and saying, look, sad things. You're kind of there's a kind of a tingling tension in the air between you and your characters, because you're taking them very seriously. Like you're in writing all the details of difficult childbirths, you're not just going, oh, horrible stuff. You're sort of, I will report what happened to you because I find birth a valuable and heroic endeavor. Yeah. So yeah, none of that is depressing. And also, I would say you always need conflict in a book, but if the conflict is coming from the outside in the form of this horrifying pandemic, you can actually have the people get on very well. So there's a bit of friction between Julia and one of the nuns, but I mean, mostly she and the doctor and she and Brighty get on really well, and the women are all pretty nice to each other. And you can do all that because death is stalking the corridors, So oddly enough, that can leave you with human relationships that are very, very nurturing. Because you don't have to have them squabbling all the time, Whereas if you set a book in a beautiful Italian villa, you've got to have the family fighting like cats.
Yeah, I love how there's a bit of nervousness around Dr. Lynn coming, but I really like that you create this camaraderie between the women, and it's really lovely. I think it's a really that also to me seems like a political move. I mean, you could have the women scrapping all the time, but you don't do that, and that's pretty great. So are there lessons from this book about how emergencies and resilience are viewed in Irish culture?
It's funny, because it's about a pandemic, I tend to think of the conclusions I'm drawing as fairly universal ones, especially as, with COVID, it's been kind of unnerving how much the book for me has been echoed by headlines I've been hearing from all over the world. For instance, I made up a series of government posters that Julie will see on the wall to try and capture the way a lot of governments at the time just felt they could not tell the truth about this. For instance, all the countries that fought in the First World War, they couldn't afford to admit that the pandemic was running through their populations. So they called it the Spanish flu, just because Spain was a neutral country. So Spain could say things like, yeah, our king has the flu. In fact, it seems to have been an American flu. It began in Kansas, but they called it the Spanish flu. And, you would see xenophobic and racist cartoons kind of, personifying the flu as Senor Influenza, this kind of greasy monster figure with a drooping mustache. And, just as you see Trump nowadays attempts to call it the Wuhan virus. So the kind of political echoes have been worldwide. Or again, when, when I was inventing these government posters, I would have them say things in a very sort of weirdly reassuring, vaguely reassuring tone, like, the government has the situation well in hand, where they're really in denial about the horrors of the flu because they can't afford to admit that they're incompetent or to allow morale to sink, And similarly, when, say, in the UK, Boris Johnson came out with his sort of stage 2 slogan, which was stay alert. I thought that's so 1918, It doesn't actually tell you what to do. It's so lacking in specifics, but it subtly implies that it'll be your fault if you catch the flu while, on the underground on your way to work. You're somehow meant to be staying alert against this completely invisible virus.
Yeah. I'm in Melbourne in Australia and lockdown listening with interest. I've just ordered the book. What you're saying about the health system is still so evident today. Thank you.
Oh, you see, if I was doing an event just in Ottawa, I probably wouldn't get that person in Australia at the event. So, I think we should all appreciate that there are certain good things about this Zoom year we're having.
Zoom year, yeah.
Hopefully it'll only be a year.
Where did your ideas for the main porter come from? Did you?
Porter, yeah, groin, I call him. Yeah.
That was great. Yeah.
I'm trying to think. Yeah, groin grew out of two things. They were great singers back then. People sang in everyday life. They didn't feel that singing was something professionalized. And it's funny, I came across the same attitude when I visited China in recent years, and our guide on the Great Wall of China, he just sang along to his phone as he cantered along the Wall of China ahead of us. And it made me realize that it's only a recent cultural sort of hang up in the West to feel that, singing is something professionals do on Spotify. So people still sang aloud a lot in World War I. And I wanted somebody to be kind of bursting into song. And I thought, okay, if he's incongruously cheerful in his songs, that could really irritate the staff. And then I thought, he could also use some of those comical, roundabout ways of referring to death, like, turn up your toes or heading west or catching the last train. So I imagined him almost as a creature of his verbal tics, that he has all these playful ways of referring to death and singing songs and so on, and that basically he would get on Julia's nerves, but that he has a story of his own that she doesn't know, and that really only Brighty will think to extract from him. So yeah, he's a minor character, but it's just as important to get those ones right, And also I knew that he and Julia would be having a bit of conflict about the whole issue of sort of men versus women, because he's rather resentful that women over 30 have just been granted the vote at the point in my novel, and Julia's just turning 30, and he says to her, you women don't really deserve it, do you? Because you don't pay the blood tax, you don't go to war, and Julia says to him, look around you, this is women's war right here. So I knew they were going to have this serious conversation, but I didn't want her to be, the one who's always right. So I thought there'll be another moment in the book where she realizes she's completely misjudged groin, and that way you keep the relationships between your characters nicely unpredictable and balanced. You don't want one who's the priggish one who's always right. You want to kind of I don't know, let them take their turns at being right.
Yeah. And the same person who asked the question says, I love the end of the novel and what happens with between Julia and groin.
Okay, good. Everyone's doing a good job of not doing any spoilers there.
Yeah, I had to rephrase that.
It's funny, isn't it? We can never really discuss the second half of novels. There's just as much to say about them, but unless you're in a graduate seminar where everybody's read the book, you never really get to talk about the second half because of the whole wish not to spoil it. There's a real art to writing book reviews, isn't there? Because again, you want to be able to discuss things but without wrecking it.
Yeah, I once went to an event with a writer and I ruined the ending of the book because I loved the book so much. I said something and everyone was really upset. So I'm always wary of discussing the second.
But anyone who drops a great spoiler at a public event, it's inevitably because they loved the book. That's the thing. It's, you know, because in their mind, everyone must have read the book already, and, you know, they're speaking from the heart. So, you know, I forgive it every time it happens because it's clearly done in a spirit of mad enthusiasm, you know. I know, but this is what's great about book clubs, you know, because I'm in a book club called The Furies, and I've been in it for 20 years, and we can really hammer over a book because we've all either read it or should have read it. And if one of our group hasn't read it, we're telling her the whole story anyway and telling her she should have read it. So that's one reason that, you know, obviously there's Oprah, but apart from that, there's another reason book clubs have risen up, which is that it is very satisfying to be able to discuss a book, you know, freely without having to, you know, protect the suspense by not mentioning the second half.
Yeah, absolutely. So did any initially minor characters become major during the writing process?
Interesting. No, I would say the major change that happened was that I was trying to keep Dr. Lynn fictional. I can't remember, she was Dr. something else, like Dr. Johnson or something. And then really, she seemed so distinctive, and my agent wanted more of Dr. Lynn talking politics and wanted to really let me, you know, wanted me to bring Dr. Lynn slightly farther forward. And I thought, okay, at that point, I should give her real name, you know. Yeah. So that's the only way in which she kind of, you know, broke the rules that I had set for her, as it were. It's funny, I was really, because when I was growing up, you know, Irish history lessons in school, for instance, were all about our revolutionary process. When did we finally manage to break free? And so I was turned off all that, and I associated with the IRA, you know, shooting people in the kneecaps and stuff. I was just not interested in the great national question, you know. I wanted to just enjoy the fruits of our liberty without having to endlessly analyze the history. And so I've never really written about, you know, Ireland's revolutionary past. But in this novel, I tried to keep it in the background, and it started creeping in a bit. So through Dr. Lynn, I kind of allowed Julia to start seeing some of those connections. I mean, she still doesn't get completely converted to the Republican cause, but she starts to at least see why it might matter who's running a country. You know, she starts to care about the politics of it at the very kind of, you know, visceral level of, you know, wanting enough food and clean water for her patients. She starts to at least ask those questions.
Yeah. Someone is really interested in the cutting of the bone, the Irish surgical. What about that?
Oh yes. Yeah, I think that's something, again, I sort of spelled out a bit more in the second draft. I didn't actually want to include one of these operations, symphysiotomy or pubiotomy, where basically in Ireland, instead of doing a cesarean, which would leave a woman possibly unable to give birth again, so it would like finish off her breeding chances, doctors used to do this hideous operation where they would, you know, cut the pelvis to allow it to move an inch apart. And, you know, then the woman's, you know, uterus would be preserved for future many babies. And this has become such a painful controversy in Ireland because many women have protested to the government, and there's been a big inquiry and court cases about this. And many women say they were left crippled by this. And then many of the doctors are like, there's no real evidence that you had the operation or that it crippled you. So it's a fiercely painful controversy, but it was a very distinctively Irish practice. It's not the only place in the world that this operation is ever used. It's still occasionally used today, because it's easier to do than a cesarean. But it was used an awful lot in Ireland as part of this pro-natalist policy of, you know, whatever about saving the baby, that wasn't always their priority. They often didn't really think they'd be able to save a baby in difficulties, but they concentrated above all on preserving a woman's childbearing capacities. So the system really prioritized baby making. And I didn't actually want to include one of these operations in my novel. You know, there are limits even for me, but I thought it might be an interesting thing to add to the second draft, that one of the women, like the baby's sort of stuck and the doctor is saying, okay, we'll do the operation now. And Julia, you know, even though she's been trained to not question doctor's decisions, she's thinking, oh, please, can we avoid this operation if possible? So she manages to, you know, I found a particular position that a woman could be put in one of these old books. And I thought, just possibly if Julia puts her in this position, it might get the baby out, you know. But yeah, that would be an example of one of the ways in which Ireland is looking at its past, you know, and you know, these operations lasted until the 1980s. So there are many things that were done when I was a teenager even, that we now look at in horror and we say, what kind of nation were we, you know?
Emma Donoghue, thank you so much for the chat. It's been lovely. And I have to wrap up. Everyone's saying it's wrap up time. So thank you everyone for watching, and thank you to the Ottawa Public Library. And we have a lot more happening at the Ottawa Writers Fest, many more events, virtual events. So please tune in.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.